Montana Territory, May 1879. Dust clung to her boots, her dress hem torn and her breath burned raw, but Delaney Hartley did not stop walking. The sun was high when she left, and now it hung low, bleeding gold across the endless prairie behind her. 30 miles, maybe more. She had not counted past the first 10. She only knew she had to get away from the man who made her believe in love and then shattered it like cheap glass. Her feet ached, her lips split from wind and thirst, and still she kept going. Delaney did not look back. The small town of Elkhorn Ridge finally rose ahead like a mirage turned real, just a cluster of buildings, a church steeple, and a water tower rising from the dry earth. She stumbled into town with nothing but a satchel over her shoulder and a heart cracked in too many places to count. She had walked 30 miles just to forget him, the man who had promised her a home, a life, a future, then married someone else 2 weeks before the wedding. She had watched from the back of the church, hidden behind a veil of tears, realizing she'd been nothing but a distraction, not a choice. Delaney reached the edge of the town's main street and leaned against the post outside the saloon. Her legs gave out under her and she slid down to the boards, head resting against the cool wood. Her eyes fluttered shut. A voice cut through the haze. "You all right there, miss?" She blinked. A cowboy stood in front of her, tall and lean, his shirt rolled up to the elbows, dust on his hat, and a lasso looped over one shoulder. His eyes were the color of slate, steady and quiet. "I am fine," she said, though her voice cracked, and she looked anything but. He crouched in front of her. "You look like you walked through hell." "I did." She tried to rise, but her legs would not hold. He caught her by the arm before she could fall. "Name's Dawson Hale. You need water and food." "I do not need anything," she said, but her tone was weak. "Well, I am not the type to walk past someone who looks like they might fall apart. I got a ranch just outside town. You can rest there. No strings, just help." Delaney hesitated. She did not know him, but she had nowhere else to go. She nodded. Dawson helped her into his wagon, hitching his horse quick and quiet. She leaned back against the rickety bench seat, too tired to ask questions. He let her be, guiding the horses down the dusty road that led out of town, quiet except for the creak of the wheels and the wind in the grass. His place sat tucked against a rise, with a view of the distant mountains and a small corral where 2 horses grazed. A modest house stood beside a barn, smoke curling from the chimney. It smelled like stew. Dawson helped her inside, and she sank onto the couch near the fire. He poured water into a tin cup and handed it to her without a word. She drank deep, her hands trembling. "You got someone who hurt you?" he asked softly. She looked at him, eyes narrowing. "What makes you ask that? You have the look of someone who trusted the wrong man." She did not answer. He nodded like he understood. "I will not ask more than you want to say. You are safe here, miss." "Delaney," she said after a pause. "Delaney Hartley." He gave a small nod. "You can rest here as long as you need." She fell asleep beside the fire, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like cedar and sun. For the first time in weeks, her dreams did not end in heartbreak. The next morning, she woke to the sound of chickens and the smell of bacon. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, warm on her face. She stretched slowly, surprised to find her body no longer aching with every breath. Dawson stood in the kitchen, frying pan in hand. He looked at her with a quiet glance, not surprised she had woken. "I made coffee," he said. "And breakfast." She sat at the table, hunger creeping back into her belly like a thaw after a long freeze. He set a plate down in front of her, eggs, bacon, and a biscuit. "You live alone?" she asked between bites. "Yeah. My folks passed on, no brothers, no wife." She met his eyes. "Why not?" he shrugged. "Never found someone who made me want to stay still." She chewed slowly. "Maybe you were looking in the wrong places. Maybe." He looked at her then, longer this time. For the next few days she helped around the house gathering eggs, sweeping the porch, mending a torn shirt of his. He never asked questions, never pushed, just offered small kindnesses, a cup of tea, a book by the fire, a smile that stayed quiet but steady. One afternoon she found him in the barn, working the saddle leather. "You ever get tired of all this quiet?" she asked. He looked up. "No, sometimes quiet's the only place a man can hear himself think." She stepped closer, her fingers brushing the edge of the stall. "I thought if I walked far enough I could forget him." "Did it work?" She shook her head. "But I do not think I need to forget any more." He set the saddle down. "No, no," she said, voice low. "I think I just needed to remember who I was before him." He watched her carefully, every inch of him still. "And who is that?" "Someone who still wants to believe in good men." Dawson closed the space between them, not fast, not bold. Just one step, then another, his hand lifting to tuck a strand of her hair behind her ear. "Then I hope you look at me long enough to remember." Her breath caught, and in that moment something shifted. Not loud, not wild, but real. She had walked 30 miles to forget a man who broke her, and found a cowboy who was starting to put her back together. The sky turned pewter the following morning, heavy with promise. Wind slid down off the mountains, stirring the grass in low swells. Delaney pulled Dawson's coat tighter around her shoulders as she stepped onto the porch. The boards felt cool beneath her bare feet, the earth not yet warmed by sun. He was already outside, tending to the fence that bordered the eastern pasture. One post leaned at an angle, its base rotted through. She watched him shift his weight as he worked, muscles moving beneath the worn fabric of his shirt. His dog, a speckled cattle mutt with one torn ear, lay nearby, tail twitching. She crossed the yard with slow steps, the hem of her skirt brushing due heavy weeds. "You always start early?" she asked. He didn't look up. "Best time to work before the heat settles." She crouched beside the crooked post. "You want help?" He set the replacement beam down and finally looked at her. "You know anything about fencing?" "I know a beam should stand straight, and that's more than I did yesterday." A brief pause. Then, "All right, hold this steady." She pressed her palms to the wood, fingers curling around splinters. He knelt beside her, driving stakes into the soil. Their arms brushed once and neither pulled away. They worked until the sun broke through the cloud bank, casting pale light across the field. Sweat curled along her hairline. When he stood back to check their work, she did too, brushing dirt from her hands. "You ever think about starting over someplace new?" she asked. He tipped his hat back. "I don't much see the point in chasing what ain't broke. Sometimes the thing that's broke is inside you." His eyes flicked to hers, thoughtful. "And sometimes fixing it don't mean leaving. Just means letting someone see you trying." Delaney looked away, the breeze lifting strands of her hair. Later, she sat on the barn's loft ledge, legs swinging over the edge. Dawson leaned against a post below, holding a bit of rope he hadn't touched in minutes. "You always been alone out here?" she asked. "Had a neighbor once. Old man named Whitley. Used to trade me seed potatoes for firewood. He died last winter. Sorry." He was ready to go. Said he'd seen enough springs to last a lifetime. She leaned her chin against her knee. "I used to think I'd live in a town forever. I liked the noise, made things feel less sharp." "You miss it?" "No," she said, almost surprised. "Not anymore." His gaze didn't waver. "You think you'd stay if you had reason?" "I think I'm waiting to find one." They didn't speak after that. He returned to the stalls, checking on a mare due to foal soon. Delaney watched a hawk wheel overhead, its shadow crossing the barn roof. That evening, she helped prepare supper. She peeled potatoes while Dawson sliced the last of the salt pork. Her hands moved steady, the knife scraping against tin. He passed her a jar of beans without looking up. Got a letter from town, he said, her hands paused. From who? Guy I knew from cattle drives. He's starting a feed co-op. Asked if I'd come on to help run it. She set the knife down. Would you go? Don't know yet. Be a big change. She dried her hands on her apron. You don't strike me as someone who changes easy. He looked at her then. I don't. But sometimes you meet someone who makes staying the same feel like losing something. She felt the words settle in her chest, quiet and warm. That night, thunder rolled in from the west. She woke to the sound of rain on the roof, steady and soft. The fire had died down, leaving only coals. When she rose to check the latch on the door, she saw him standing in the kitchen, barefoot, holding a cup of coffee. You always drink it cold? She asked. He turned, lips curving. Only when I can't sleep. She stepped closer. The lamp on the counter lit his face in amber, shadows softening the lines near his mouth. I think I found my reason, she said. His brows lifted slightly, but he didn't speak. She placed her hand on the edge of the table, steadying herself. It's not the quiet I needed. It's the steadiness. He stepped forward slow until they stood breath close. Rain whispered against the window. You sure? He asked. I walked here to forget a man who made me doubt everything. And now I remember what it feels like to be seen, not wanted for a promise or a lie. Just seen. He reached up, fingers brushing hers. Then stay. I will. Outside, the rain deepened, drumming into the earth like a blessing. Inside, they stood still, two people who hadn't looked for each other but had found what they didn't know they needed. Not through grand words or hurried declarations, but through the quiet things. Mended fences, shared meals, the space to heal, and the choice to begin again. Together. 2 weeks passed like spring runoff, quiet at first, then swift. The days lengthened, and the cottonwoods along the creek wore their new leaves like a promise. Delaney had taken to rising early, not because she had to, but because the mornings felt like hers again. She tied her hair back with a strip of muslin and walked the fields barefoot while the mist clung low, soaking the toes of her stockings. Dawson never asked where she went. He just left the door unlatched. That morning, she found him by the creek, kneeling beside a calf with a twisted leg. He'd splinted it with willow branches, binding them tight with twine. Will it walk again? She asked, crouching beside him. If it don't panic and tear the wrap off, it might. He glanced over. Most things can be mended if you catch 'em early. She ran a hand down the calf's neck. Harder when you let him fester. Harder, he agreed, but not impossible. They said nothing else for a while. The water moved over stones in a hush, and the wind brought the smell of wet earth and pine. Back at the house, Dawson brought in a crate from the wagon. He set it on the table with a grunt and wiped his hands on his trousers. You ever used a hand loom? He asked. She blinked. Not since I was a girl. My grandmother had one. Well, I found this at a farm 2 counties over, traded for it. She stood slowly, brushing flour from her hands. Why? He opened the crate and lifted the frame out. Figured you might want something of your own to work on, something that don't answer to weather or cattle. Her throat tightened. You didn't have to. I know. He folded the wrapping cloth and set it aside. But I wanted to. She stepped closer and touched the edge of the frame. The wood was smooth, the shape familiar. Her fingers trembled once, then steadied. I forgot what it felt like to make something just to make it, she said. Then you ought to start remembering. That night, she lit a lantern and sat at the loom, threading the shuttle with blue-dyed yarn Dawson had bought from a woman in Elkhorn Ridge. Each pass was slow at first, her fingers stumbling over old patterns. But by the time the fire had burned down to coals, the cloth had begun to take shape. Dawson passed behind her once, resting his hand briefly on the back of her chair. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The next few days brought heat. The the kind that shimmered above fence posts and drew rattlers to the rocks. Dawson came in from the fields with his collar soaked and dirt caked into the lines of his hands. Delaney fetched water from the well, her shoulders pinked by sun. She tied a cloth around her neck and carried cool rags out to him without being asked. One afternoon, while stringing barbed wire across the southern boundary, Dawson dropped his glove and sliced his palm. Blood dripped down his wrist, quick and dark. Delaney caught his hand before he could brush it off. "You'll get it infected," she said, pulling her apron up to press the wound. He winced but didn't pull away. "You always this quick to scold, when it's earned." He looked at her then, the corner of his mouth twitching. "You're not afraid to stand your ground. I've already lost too much to stay quiet," he exhaled slow. "I'll remember that." She cleaned the cut by lamplight, his hand steady in hers. The skin along his knuckles was calloused and sun-dark, but his fingers were gentle, unmoving as she wrapped the cloth. "You ever think about marriage?" he asked, voice low, her hands paused. "I did, once. I mean now," she met his eyes. "I think it used to mean giving something up. But maybe it doesn't have to. Not if it's built right," he said. "Not if it's two people who know how to hold each other steady." She tied off the bandage and let his hand go. "Then yes, I think I've started to think about it." That night the wind died. The silence was thick enough to feel. He found her on the porch, rocking slow in his mother's old chair. She didn't turn when he stepped outside. He leaned against the railing, arms crossed. "I've got a ring," he said after a time. "Used to belong to my grandmother, kept it in a box in the loft. Never thought I'd find someone to give it to." She looked up at him, eyes catching the moonlight. "And now I think I'd regret it every day of my life if I didn't ask." She rose and stepped toward him, close enough to feel the warmth between them. "You don't have to kneel," she said. "I wasn't planning to." His voice was soft, serious. "But I'll ask just the same." He reached into his pocket and brought out a thin silver band, worn but clean. He held it between them. "Will you stay?" he asked. "Not just for a season, for good." She didn't look away. "Yes." He slid the ring onto her finger. There was no kiss, not yet. Just the two of them standing close, the porch creaking beneath their feet, and the quiet knowledge that something hard-earned had shifted into something sure. They went inside together, the door closing behind them with a soft click. Outside, the land slept under the stars. Inside, two people began the rest of their life with nothing loud. Nothing hurried, just the kind of love that takes root deep and holds on through every storm. By early June, the creek ran low again, and the cottonwoods rattled dry even in the morning stillness. Dawson had taken to riding out before dawn to check the grazing line. Elk had been nosing the edge of the property, and one of the younger bulls had already torn down a stretch of wire. Delaney stayed behind, not because he asked it of her, but because the house had begun to feel like something she could tend, something she could trust. She stood in the garden with her skirts hitched, pulling weeds with quick fingers. The earth was pale and cracked, but the carrots had taken root, and the sage bush near the fence had bloomed a pale purple. She wiped her brow with the inside of her arm and stepped back as hoofbeats rolled over the rise. Dawson dismounted, dust clinging to his boots and the edge of his hat. He led the horse into the shade and rubbed the animal's neck before speaking. "Found tracks near the north slope, bigger than elk, might be wolves." She tightened the knot on her apron. "You think they'll come close?" "Unlikely, unless the drought gets worse. But I'll set traps near the edge, just in case." She glanced toward the barn. The mare's favoring her leg again, might be the same tendon from last spring. "I'll take a look after supper." He hesitated, then added, "I traded for a new tack harness. Should help her gait if it's strain and not tear." Delaney nodded, her gaze drifting toward the far fence line. "You've been quiet since yesterday." He adjusted the strap of his saddlebag but didn't answer right away. Had a letter come through town, from a cousin near Helena. He's getting married in August. She brushed the soil from her hands. You clothes, not especially, but he said something in the letter, asked if I'd bring someone, said he'd set us a place. She looked up. Us, he met her eyes then. If you'd want to come. Be a long ride and awkward, most likely, but it'd mean something to me. Delaney stepped closer, the wind teasing the loose strands at her temple. I don't know that I'm ready for a room full of strangers. I wouldn't ask if I thought it'd hurt. She considered, then gave a quiet nod. I'll go. He exhaled, shoulders easing. We'll leave in 2 weeks. Ride slow, take the canyon trail. That night, Dawson brought out the oilskin saddle bags and laid them open on the table. Delaney packed a tin of dried apples, her blue shawl, and the small stitched square she'd finished on the loom, 2 birds facing each other, beaks nearly touching. I don't have a dress for a wedding, she said as she folded the shawl. You don't need one, he murmured. You already look like someone who belongs. The ride began under a sky the color of ash, with the sun burning pale behind thin clouds. They followed the river north, then veered west into the canyon, where the air cooled and pine gave way to fir. Dawson led the way, his horse calm beneath him, and Delaney followed at a steady pace, her own mount sure-footed and lean. At night, they made camp beneath the rock face, the fire small but steady. He cooked beans and cornmeal on the flat stone while she rolled out the blanket and hung her boots to dry. Neither of them spoke much, but the silence wasn't heavy, just full. Near the 4th evening, as they followed the bend where the stream narrowed into a trickle, Delaney spoke without turning. Do you ever think about what it would have been like if I hadn't kept walking that day? I do, he said after a beat, and I don't like the thought. I might have gone back, might have begged him to explain. You didn't. She slowed her horse a little. No. I didn't. They reached Helena the next morning. The town pressed close with its brick buildings and narrow lanes, nothing like the open stretch of land they'd left behind. Dawson guided them to a small boarding house where a widow he knew from cattle drives had set aside a room. Delaney stood by the window after they unpacked. Miners and merchants passed below, and the clang of hammer on metal echoed from the blacksmith a block over. You all right? Dawson asked, setting his hat on the bureau. I forgot what it felt like to be surrounded by so many lives at once. You want to leave? No, she turned. I want to see what it feels like to be seen beside you. The wedding was held 2 mornings later, just outside town, beneath a canvas canopy strung with pine boughs. Dawson wore a shirt she hadn't seen before, cream-colored and pressed, and Delaney dressed in a borrowed skirt laced with faded rose ribbon. They stood at the edge of the crowd, hands brushing but not touching. When the music started, Dawson looked at her once, then offered his arm. She took it. Later, as the light fell sharp and orange across the field, he led her to a quiet spot near the fence. The sound of laughter drifted behind them, but out here, it felt distant. He turned toward her. I know it's not much what I can offer. You offered me a place to breathe, she said. And a way forward. I want to build something with you, not just live beside each other, her voice caught. Then let's start with that. He kissed her then, slow, sure, the way someone seals a vow they've already begun keeping. By the time they rode back south, the creeks had filled again, and the grass had turned soft at the edges. When they reached the hill above the ranch, Delaney paused, looking out over the land. He turned in the saddle. You see it different now, she nodded. It looks like home. And beside him, it finally was. The sun had just cleared the ridge when Delaney stepped barefoot onto the porch, a mug of chicory coffee warming her hands. The prairie beyond the fence unfurled like a patchwork of gold and green, quiet and still except for the slow movement of cattle along the southern slope. Dawson had gone out early to check the far spring, and she could see the distant shape of his horse threading between the cottonwoods. Inside, dough rose beneath a damp cloth. She'd milled the flour herself the night before, using grain Dawson had traded for from a homestead west of their property. There was something steadying in the rhythm of it kneading, waiting, shaping like the land itself had taught her how to be patient again. She'd sewn new curtains for the bedroom the day before, using the last of the fabric Dawson had brought back from Helena. They were pale blue, the same shade as the sky right before a storm. That morning, she'd washed her hands twice before touching them. When Dawson returned, his boots were damp with creek water and his shirt clung to his back. He tied the reins to the post, then leaned down to brush mud from his trouser cuff. "Spring held?" she asked as he climbed the steps. "Running clear," he said, wiping his brow with a handkerchief. "Saw fresh deer tracks, too. Might mean the herd's moving east again." She stepped aside so he could pass through the door. "You hungry?" "Always," he said, and his eyes caught hers with a look that said more than the word itself. She ladled stew into 2 bowls, rich with beans and smoked meat from the cellar. They ate at the table near the window, the breeze stirring the edge of the curtain. Dawson reached for the bread without speaking, then paused and looked at her hands. "You been weaving again?" he asked. "Last night. I started something new. A blanket this time. For the winter, for us," she said, her voice quiet. He didn't answer, just nodded once and went back to eating, but his hand stayed resting on the table beside hers long after the bread was gone. Later that afternoon, the widow from Elkhorn Ridge arrived at their gate in a 2-wheeled cart, her son perched beside her with a basket of duck eggs. Delaney stepped out to meet them, wiping her hands on a cloth. "Thought you might want some hens," the woman said. "My coop's near bursting and yours is still too quiet." Delaney glanced toward the small structure they'd built near the barn. "We've been meaning to get some." "Consider it a wedding gift, then." Late, but honest, Dawson came from the barn to help unload. His sleeves were rolled back, revealing a long scrape along his forearm, fresh and red. The widow frowned. "You let him go all day with that showing." Delaney raised a brow. "He didn't say a word about it." Dawson shrugged. "Didn't seem worth fussing over." The widow snorted. "Men never think anything's worth fussing over." Delaney cleaned the scrape with water and pine salve after they'd gone, making him sit still on the porch bench while she worked. "You could have told me," she said, dabbing the cloth gently. "You had enough to tend. I married you, Dawson Hale. If you think I won't fuss over a cut, you haven't learned a thing." He chuckled low in his throat. "I've learned plenty, just forgot for a bit." She leaned forward and kissed the edge of his jaw. "Well, remember next time." That evening the chickens squawked from the coop, adjusting to their new home. Dawson stacked wood beneath the eaves, and Delaney strung the last of the herbs from the rafters to dry. The house smelled of rosemary and cedar, and the floor was cool underfoot. When the first stars appeared, they sat outside again, his arm around her shoulders and her head tucked beneath his chin. The dog lay curled at their feet, twitching in sleep. "I've been thinking," Dawson said, his voice low. "About what?" "About building a smokehouse. If we're laying down roots proper, we ought to be able to keep meat through the frost." "I can help," she said. "I know you can. That's the part I keep coming back to." She tilted her face up. "What part?" "That I don't have to do it alone anymore." The next morning they hitched the wagon and rode into town to file the land papers under both their names. The clerk raised his brow when they handed him the form. "Miss Hartley?" "Mrs. Hale now," she said, her voice steady. The clerk tipped his hat. "Well then, congratulations." They left with the deed folded neatly between them, the ink still drying. Dawson slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, and his thumb brushed hers as he did. The road home was quiet except for the jangle of the harness and the creak of the wagon wheels. At one point, Delaney reached down and took his hand, not because she needed to, but because she could. The days that followed settled into their own rhythm. She planted more lavender by the fence. He started cutting logs for the smokehouse. When the mare foaled, they both stayed up through the night to make sure the colt stood strong. He did, by morning. They took supper on the porch most evenings, watching the light slip behind the hills. And sometimes, when the wind was still, Dawson would reach for her hand and hold it in silence, like that alone could say everything he never found the words for. By the time the leaves began to turn, the house no longer felt borrowed. It was theirs. The walls held their laughter, their arguments, the quiet in between. The woven blanket lay folded at the end of their bed, finished and warm. They kept no clock, no calendar on the wall. But they marked the seasons by what they built together: fences mended, seeds planted, cloth spun, and promises kept. And in all of it, they stayed steady as the land beneath them, and just as true.